Hi, my name is Marc Crawley and welcome to Diversita Connect. Today's webinar or podcast, because we have a podcast now, which is growing quickly, which is great to see, is about my experience of being a parent of a neurodivergent child. So what I'm going to do today is go through various points where we had different experiences and I suppose different transitions around how our life and our journeys. It is obviously going to be my experience, and we don't expect it to be relevant to everyone who is a parent of a neurodivergent child, but hopefully there'll be some things here that are quite useful. So we're going to cover a few areas today, and I think the first one will be the initial signs, for want of a better phrase, and diagnosis. I suppose my initial reaction, family and friends, and how that conversation was, early education and EHCP. My wife's absolutely invaluable support, PIP and financial support. So obviously this is relevant for the UK, strengths and interests and how that developed over time, education transitions, and of course where we are today. So I'm not going to talk too much around things that are very personal, sort of like names and universities and schools and all these other things. So I'm going to keep it quite general. I might accidentally slip in names here and there, but ultimately this is really a bit of an overview of our experience. So when I look at the initial signs and diagnosis, and this was, my son was born in 2007, so this was around 2009, I suppose now. One of the biggest indicators we had was that my son was nonverbal until he was around 4.5, maybe 5, started to say a few words around sort of 5.5. And I think this was probably the biggest telltale sign that there was he was thinking differently, and there was something that we wanted a little bit of advice on. I think the other thing was a few sensory challenges, some challenges around food, of course, and I think when I look back now, and there's going to be a few things I'm going to say today that I'm obviously quite ashamed to say now. I was comparing a lot, right? So I was comparing my son's development to other children. And I always remember a friend of ours had a daughter who was a year younger, but in terms of speech, social development, interaction with others, basically social communication and verbal communication, she was, based on the standard around this, far advanced of my son. So we started to maybe have a look a little bit at trying to get a bit of advice. At the time, my son was in a private nursery, and from that point onwards, it was a case of, okay, got a little bit of assistance there. Then there was a specialist nursery, which was quite close to our home. My son went there after being there for about 6 to 9 months, went through a formal review process and was given an autism diagnosis, right? So, and that was when he was around 3.5. So at that point, obviously we got the diagnosis, we knew where we were. We'd had, to be fair, some very, very good support from our local authority and throughout the process. And I know this isn't always the case, so but it was quite, I would say, quite a smooth process for us. So when we look back really at this area of time in our lives where we had the diagnosis, we were learning more about autism, we were learning more about our son, who obviously had some traits and some differences and some needs at that point. I think what we quickly moved towards was, okay, this is not about us. This is about us trying to make sure he gets as much support as possible. So it was quite a short reaction, but I do remember it being quite intense. And I'm sure a lot of parents probably go through this initially, where it's a case of there's a mismanagement or sort of reimagining of expectations or reevaluation of what's important. But hopefully it's like anything, you kick into that, okay, I'm just going to make sure my son's protected, looked after, and has everything he needs from that point onwards. So I think we were quite fortunate at a time where me and my wife could split duties as well. I was working quite long hours, and my wife was able to stay at home and give Thomas a lot more support than maybe some people have the ability or the option to do so. So that really helped, without doubt. But I think when I look back at the reaction now, it's not one that I'm particularly proud of, but I think it was an important one to almost come through. And I think from that point onwards, it's been obviously a very much different journey. And now, obviously, I'm working in this space, right? So it's but one of those that, again, I don't think any parent should be too embarrassed about an initial reaction. I think it's really about how you move forward from that point onwards. So the next part really is family and friends and navigating this conversation. So I will say I've got a very good circle of friends who I've known since school, which is great, and they were great, very, very supportive. Again, not a lot of experience around autism or neurodiversity or anything like that, but were very supportive. I remember telling them on an email back then. This was, I think, before WhatsApp maybe. And they were very, very supportive. Our family were good, don't get me wrong. I think particularly they were a little bit older, of course, and we were trying to, particularly my grandparents at the time, trying to get them to understand exactly what this was. I think my dad in particular was maybe a little bit more along the lines of, he'll grow out of it. You don't want to label, that type of thing, which was quite interesting and a little bit difficult to navigate, because you don't want to be, you're dealing with your own, obviously, understanding of this. So you don't want to have to be reassuring other people who, to be honest, their job is to be there to support. Right? So, but ultimately, I think the family and friends support was pretty good, and we wasn't. It got a little bit different as my son got older, but ultimately at the time, and I think the initial disclosure was pretty good. I think, again, just touching on the point of when my son got older, because he then started to be verbal and started to mask a little bit and started to navigate social situations, inevitably you then start getting, well, there's nothing wrong with him. Look, he's fine. Look, I mean, and almost it's coming across ableist, etc., and these type of things. I always say these comments probably come from a good place, but at the time, it's not very realistic. And ultimately, a lot of our family and friends didn't see what particularly my wife was having to navigate on a day-to-day basis with my son in terms of some of the traits, some of the OCD behaviors, and all of these other bits and pieces. So again, it was a bit of a checkered conversation and an inconsistent one, but ultimately, since then, and I think where we are now, we do feel quite supported by family and friends. The other thing was early education and EHCP. So my son went to a private nursery initially for the first year and a half, or maybe a year. And it was there where we started to obviously get a little bit of assistance. We then obviously mentioned already that he went to a nursery that specialised in particularly neurodiversity and other development challenges, as they called them then. And at that point, obviously, after getting a diagnosis, back then in Bromley, where we live, the process of getting an EHCP and getting support into education was relatively straightforward. So getting the actual financial support and commitment from our local borough was very, very straightforward. It certainly didn't feel like a challenging conversation. It was almost like, well, you get a diagnosis, you get an EHCP. Now that's changed quite a lot, as I understand now, but at the time it was pretty seamless. I think what happened then was a little bit more challenging, because my oldest son went to a primary school who made it pretty clear, and not in a not so subtle way, that they would struggle to give him the support he needs. So my son ended up going to another primary school that had a dedicated provision for SEND children, and provided and got some good support. I've got to be honest, he got a good education at infant and primary school, but we'll touch on a few reasons as to why that was the case in a second, because there was one particular factor that played into this, which was incredibly important. We'll talk about further education a little bit as we go along today. So the key factor in this was my wife's support. My wife has just been incredible with my son over the years, in terms of picking up the gaps in education, and a few other areas in terms of the type of support. And that went through right to GCSEs and even now with university, just an incredible support mechanism for my son. But one thing my wife did do when my son was in primary school was went there to work, and went there to work at a time over the lunch period where she could support him and be, again, a visible presence and give that reassurance. There's this phrase called being boringly reliable as a parent, and my wife was incredibly reliable, right? just there all the time for my son. And I think not everyone has that, right? And so he had I think a positive, reassuring experience, and as such did really well at primary school, and then went on to secondary school, and we'll talk about that in a second. But I think throughout, though, my wife's support has just, as I say, picked up some of the gaps that you get, filling out PIP applications, going into annual reviews, giving my son the support he needs at every stage of transition in his life, etc. And her presence has been incredible, but we know not everyone gets that. So that really made my life a lot easier, because I could sort of go to work and try to sort of compartmentalize my life a little bit more. And obviously we've got to have another son who obviously we want to make sure we're focusing on, etc. And that's really important, particularly during the COVID period. But my wife's support was incredible and really picked up a lot of the gaps that we had. The sort of PIP and financial support, I wasn't as close to it as maybe I should have been, but my wife navigated the PIP applications and made sure that we got all of the support we were entitled to, and that really helped. It really did. There's a lot of at the time, M&S or Marks and Spencer's chicken that we had to buy, and there was a lot of McDonald's we had to buy, and there was a lot of certain toys we had to buy, and a lot of trips that were quite expensive, but my son felt comfortable with, and all of this contributed really well towards that. So it made everything a lot easier in terms of giving my son the support he needed. I know that this is not as easy to navigate now, and if you ever need any help with PIP applications, we know someone who's great at doing these. But we did get, I think, some good financial support, and it wasn't sort of means tested either. So we used to earn quite good money, but we still got this money, which really helped. And even now we get things like Motability to help. My son's not great with travel and public transport, so again we have a car to be able to help with that as well. So that was, again, quite a seamless process, but I do understand it's probably not as seamless as it is probably today. So with strengths and interests, this was one where I think we picked up on quite quickly. My son developed his language through watching a lot of TV shows and films, and there's a really good documentary about a young lad who developed his language through watching Disney films, and it wasn't too dissimilar to my son. I realized later it was called something called echolalia. I hope I'm saying that right, where you see language and you start to piece it together and use it in certain contexts. So one of my son's favorite films was Princess and the Frog, and used to love this film and used to watch it over and over again, at least 4 or 5 times a week. But developed language from that as well, and developed language from a few other films. There's great videos we watch where my youngest son and my oldest son are doing scenes from Home Alone, for example, and again learning language in that way, which was great to see. But I think in retrospect, a lot of our interest and my son's interest aligned. So he loves film, right? Loves the mechanisms of film, loves screenplays, but mostly he loves sound design. And I do sometimes think it was probably born out of the audio in these films and how he learned to speak, and all of the factors that go into trying to create an incredible movie. So I think the strengths and interests part we probably tapped into quite quickly, because we could see that he knew a lot about certain subjects, had a deep interest, of course, like a lot of autistic young people have, in certain toys, and I think we went from sort of Lego to Marvel to Transformers and now to sort of high-end collectibles, right? But what's great now, and you'll find out obviously when we talk about education later, is that he's developed some of these interests into something that hopefully will be, for him anyway, a deep interest from years to come that maybe aligns to a career. Right? So, and I know not everyone has that opportunity, but I think one thing we did quite well was look at those strengths and look at those interests and start to nurture those and work with those and support those. And I think that really, really helped a lot when we started to transition into, okay, what sort of things are you interested in terms of higher education? What type of jobs would you want to do in the future? It seemed to work quite well, which was good to see. And then when we look at the education transitions, again, that helped, right? So my son went to secondary school, which was a dedicated school for autism, again, near where we live in Bromley, which was a good experience on the whole. A few checkered experiences here and there, but on the whole, did some great work at that school and managed to move into a situation where he did very, very well in terms of GCSEs and education achievements. And that gave him the opportunity from that point onwards to then move into college. So, but I would say, again, going back to my wife's support, without my wife's support around revision and knowing those options and navigating those and pushing the school into saying, look, we feel he's capable of a little bit more and he wants to do more, maybe wouldn't have achieved the education or the grades that he got. Right? So again, I think my wife picked up a lot of those things in the gaps. In terms of that transition, went to college near where we live in Bromley College. Again, this was probably the biggest gap between the advice we got and what we actually did, because when he was leaving secondary school, my son was advised to do almost like a foundation year at college where you focus on things like cooking and carpentry and gardening. And it's a great transition year for those who maybe don't feel that confident about going to college or a little bit unsure about what they want to do next. But my son was crystal clear, right? He wanted a career, he wanted to move towards a career or higher education within film and television. And there was a course there, and then there was various levels, level 1, 2, and 3, 3 being the highest. And he wanted to do the highest course, and he absolutely nailed it. Got distinctions across the board, and was one of the highest achieving students in that group. But what was interesting is if we'd taken the advice at face value from the secondary school, who were maybe a little bit misinformed, is suddenly you had a big jump, right, from where he would have been there to where he actually ended up being. And again, I think I put that down to my son and my wife, and that, you know what, we're going to do what we feel is best, right? So it was a really interesting time for us. And that transition has now gone on to university. So my son is currently at university studying film and media, or film and television, and with hopefully a specific focus around sound design. And all of this comes back to some of those interests. And you combine that with my wife and son pushing each other and challenging the schools, etc., to get him to where he is. And we know this isn't always the case. So I think I look back on this now and I'm incredibly proud of everyone in my house. But I think my son, who is now obviously university, doing this from where we were when he was nonverbal right at the start, back in 2010, to now being at university studying sound design, is an incredible pathway, and one that obviously we're very, very proud of. So where are we today, right? So we've mentioned obviously the education side in terms of where we are as a family. Obviously we work in Neurodiversity as a family, and both my sons help out with Diversita, and my wife works on Diversita, and obviously I work on it as well. So it's an interesting part because we talk about neurodiversity every day anyway as part of our household, but obviously now we do it. We have an organisation. So it's an interesting one because when I look at where he is now, there's still challenges, don't get me wrong, particularly around things like OCD and sort of some other areas of social navigation, which are pretty aligned with most young people getting older. But on the whole, he's really found his way. He's really found a pathway now that he feels very comfortable with. It's quite clear. We sort of make semi-joking comments about who's he going to take to the Oscars, who's he going to take to the Golden Globes, etc. My wife's got the Oscars, which annoyed me a little bit, but I'll go Golden Globes. It'll be fine. But ultimately, these are aspirations, and they're not pie in the sky aspirations based around the talent that I think my son has, the ambition, the drive, and ultimately the support that he gets from all of us, but particularly my wife. And the last thing I would say, and I think it's important to make sure that he gets acknowledged, is my oldest son has also been a very, very different support mechanism through all of this, right? Having an older brother you can look up to, having an older brother who's not only very, very social, but empathetic, inclusive, all of these things that we talk about on a day-to-day basis around neuro-inclusivity. He's just been incredible. He really has. And I don't think my son socially or confidence-wise would be where he would be without that contribution from my oldest son. So my wife and my son have just been incredibly supportive. They really have. I'd like to think my contribution is there somewhere, but it's probably a little bit more practical to try and make sure that everyone has a foundation to be able to do what they want. I still get a little bit impatient, and that's something I try to work on. And I think we sometimes have a bit of a clash of neurotypes in the house, which is probably not unusual. But ultimately, this experience has been one where I think we have had some areas which were reasonably smooth to the way they probably are now. We obviously had COVID to navigate, which was a massive deal for us as a family. But where we are now, we can see some optimism. And we know this isn't always the case for a lot of parents of neurodivergent children. We know this isn't always the case for neurodivergent individuals. But I think there's through a combination of factors, we are in a place now where hopefully we can share this story and share this journey, and hopefully it may help some, right? But it is our journey, it is our story, and it won't be the same for everyone. So hopefully it's been useful. So we will add this, of course, to our webinar collection on Diversita Connect. And so hopefully it'll be there and you can comment and ask questions. Let us know your experience of parenting or growing up as a neurodivergent individual. We'd love to hear them. We love hearing these experiences. And I work with a lot of organizations and people who do share this. We also have a live webinar discussion now. So this webinar goes out on 1 p.m. on a Monday, and then at 6 p.m. on the Wednesday, we have a discussion around this subject. Of course, this is now also a podcast and on YouTube as well. So if you're watching on those platforms or listening on those platforms, welcome. You can join Diversita Connect on the QR code on the URL that will be in the About section or the comment section, depending on the medium you're watching it on. But we're really proud to be able to share some of this content on those platforms as well. And of course, we want you to join Diversita Connect, where you can see all of our webinars, obviously meet everyone in our community, join our monthly meetups, etc. It's all free. We have a donation model if people want to donate, but ultimately all of the content on there is free. And of course, if you are on Diversita Connect already and you want to send us a direct message, of course you can speak to us there. If you're not and you want to contact us, please visit our website, and there's various contact forms, etc. as well. So thank you so much for today. A little bit of a longer video webinar podcast today, just to share this story and share this journey, but we hope it resonates. As I mentioned already, it's quite personal for us, and so we hope it's been useful. But of course, any questions, any comments, anything you need, please reach out and we'll try to come back to you. Many thanks.
Thank you for watching. Make sure to like, comment, share and subscribe, and scan the QR code to join the Diversita Connect community.